Good morning. Welcome to the ISS. My name is Virginia Comolli. I'm the Senior Fellow for Security and Development here at the Institute. Thank you for joining us today for a sobering and timely discussion on the impact of armed conflict on children. Many events and projects that we run here at IISS deal with many aspects of conflict. And I'm also pleased to say that increasingly over the past 2 to 3 years, we've really expanded the range of interlocutors that we deal with, including those who wouldn't traditionally fit into IISS partners. And Save the Children is one of those organizations that we hadn't interacted very much with in the past, but we are very keen to work more with going forward. And one example is a project that we are currently doing in my program on the conduct of war in cities and humanitarian implications of war in urban environments. And it was very important for us to expand our network, as I said, to interact with Save the Children, to interact with other humanitarian organizations, which allow us to provide a more nuanced understanding of the problem and possible solutions. So going forward, you're likely to see more events and more initiatives of this sort where we bring on board a wide array of partners. I'm very pleased today that we have the opportunity to look more closely at the human dimension of conflict, which is something that, as I mentioned, perhaps we haven't done as much in the past. And particularly, we are here to discuss what conflict means for the most vulnerable in society. An increasing number of children, and more than ever before actually, live in conflict areas and are suffering as a result of it. And so with the help of our speakers today, the aim of the discussion is to first get a better understanding of the problem, its nature and magnitude, and second also to look at what actions can be taken in order to protect children. To do so, I'm joined by Kevin Watkins, who is the CEO of Save the Children, who has a distinguished career within the UN, but also the NGO, charity, and think tank sectors. And my colleague, Anastasia Voronkova, who is our Senior Research Fellow for Armed Conflict, and she's in charge of most of our conflict-related work, as she runs the Armed Conflict Database and is the editor of the Armed Conflict Survey. Our speakers will speak for about 10-15 minutes each on the record, and after that we'll have time for questions and answers. Today we are also testing or trialing something a bit different. In addition to all of you sitting in the room with us, there will be people joining us remotely. So I have a small tablet with me, and we'll get questions from people who are listening in or watching us from afar. So welcome to them as well. But I'll now turn to our first speaker, Mr. Watkins, please.
Virginia, thank you, and it's a great privilege and pleasure to be here. Virginia, as you said, this is a non-traditional partnership, but it's a partnership that we're really proud of in Save the Children. And I think these types of partnerships are really important for us going ahead. And I say that because we're obviously a development charity. We were created 100 years ago, actually, to address the needs of children affected by the Great Conflict, or the fallout of the Great Conflict at that time, the First World War. Children who had been subjected to a humanitarian blockade. And actually our founder at that time said something which I think remains profoundly true today, is that all wars, whether they're victorious or whether they result in defeat, whether they're justified or unjustified, are ultimately wars against children, because children are among the most vulnerable people in society affected by war. I would add, if she were making that statement today, I think she would add that all wars are increasingly fought not just against children, but against humanitarian workers and development workers. That we lost 4 of our colleagues in Afghanistan a couple of months ago in Jalalabad in an attack on our compound. These were people who were delivering education to very vulnerable refugees returning to Jalalabad from Pakistan, but were perceived as targets in a conflict. And I think that is a growing feature of many of the countries in which we're working. And I think in Save the Children, we're increasingly aware that for us to address the problems and the challenges that face children in conflicts around the world, we have to get better at engaging with the military, at engaging with the diplomatic establishment, and engaging with people like you and Anastasia and others who are thinking strategically about what is going on in conflict, the changing nature of conflict. I'm very proud also that this report, which many of you will have seen outside, and I hope you'll pick up a copy of before you leave, was actually launched at the Munich Security Conference. We've also been working more actively with NATO recently on the Viking training exercise, thinking about military protocols for protecting children. And we have an ongoing partnership with the Centre for Blast Injury Studies. And actually that partnership is one of the most important things that I've read over the last couple of years, actually, coming out of this study by that centre, is understanding that when bombardments happen in urban areas in particular, that the impacts on children are not the same as the impacts on adults for all sorts of physiological, anatomical and mental reasons. And I think that has been insufficiently understood. But what comes out of that research, I think, reinforces what our founder said 100 years ago, that children are indeed among the most vulnerable of the civilians who are affected by conflict around the world. I've got around 10 to 15 minutes, so I want to do two very simple things, which is talk about the scale of the problem and the nature of the problem that we have to address, and what some of the solutions might look like. So, some aspects of the problem are at least open to measurement, to the sort of simple metrics of counting numbers. Well, one of the things that this report does, it provides evidence that we commissioned from PRIO in Oslo of the numbers of children affected by conflict. And the definition of affected by conflict used by PRIO is, I think, within children living within 50 kilometres of an active conflict area. So there are globally around 350 million children who are living in conflict-affected areas. That's 1 in 6 children globally. In the Middle East, of course, that number is much higher. And one of the most disturbing things about these numbers is that both because of demography and the changing nature of conflict, that it is going up very rapidly. That, back in the mid-1990s, it was around 200 million. It's now 350 million plus. So there are more and more children who are living in conflict areas. Many of them, of course, in areas of intensive conflict, that are actually living in cities that are right at the heart of conflicts, or in urban areas of Eastern Ghouta and other areas which are directly affected by conflict. And it's really important for all of us, I think, to understand how this vulnerable population is affected by the big shifts in the nature of conflict that are going on globally, in which you study as part of your day jobs here in IISS. The fact that the nature of civil conflict, of conflicts within borders, are increasingly fragmented and involve more and more actors. I think there are around 1,000 groups, armed groups, involved in the Syria conflict. If you went back 20 years, conflict looked very different. You typically had a major state actor and a couple of major non-state actors. So the fragmentation of conflict and the proliferation of armed non-state actors is one major shift. The duration of conflict, the average period of displacement for a refugee now is 17 years, so conflicts are increasingly protracted as well. And conflicts are increasingly urbanized. They're happening more and more in high-density urban areas. And I think all of those trends have implications for how we think about the problem. There are some aspects of the problem which are less amenable to measurement. And in an earlier life, I was lead author for a report on the impact of conflict on children. And the team that I was working with at that time, I got them all to read the Grasser-Michel report, which is a report written on the impact of armed conflict on children back in the mid-1990s. And a lot of the focus of that report was on sub-Saharan Africa. But there's a memorable phrase actually in the foreword that Grasser wrote for that report, where she described what she had documented in terms of what was happening to children as indicative of a moral vacuum. That was the phrase she used. And she said it's difficult to imagine a descent into a lower level of morality than she had witnessed in what she'd heard from children who were affected by conflict. The one thing I think you'd have to say that Grasser got wrong in retrospect was she underestimated our humanity's capacity to plumb even greater depths, which is where we are today. Because if you look at conflicts around the world, it has become normalized to kill children, to specifically target children for military action, or to treat children as a completely irrelevant, dispensable form of collateral damage, to devise a military strategy that pays no heed to whether the children may be affected. It has become normalized and almost an acceptable strategy on the part of many non-state actors in particular, but also some state actors, to rape children, to subject them to appalling levels of physical violence. It has become normal to bomb classrooms when children are in those classrooms, to abduct children and to hold them hostage, to bomb the health facilities that could treat them and support them. And it has become acceptable to operate humanitarian blockades, which, if not explicitly designed to starve children and harm still children, will have that inevitable consequence. And the fact that we've had the head of a state of a government that has been operating such a blockade, Saudi Arabia, recently invited to Buckingham Palace and number 10 Downing Street, while the military that person oversees is orchestrating what will potentially become the worst famine in the last 50 years, I think speaks volumes to another aspect of the problem that I want to highlight, which is the growing sense of impunity surrounding these crimes against children. And I would say if you wanted, what I've described previously, in a sense, are symptoms of this deeper malaise. And if you wanted one word that summarized the malaise, that word is impunity. The fact that you can murder, rape, kidnap, bomb schools, bomb clinics with no consequence, I think speaks to the heart of the deeper challenge that we're addressing today in this meeting. To give you some partial sense of the scale of what we're talking about, the annual report of the UN Secretary General, which monitors and reports to the Security Council on the 6 grave violations of the rights of children to be protected in conflict, documented around 4,000 abuses in the last report, which covered the year 2016, around 4,000 abuses by state actors, and over 11,000 abuses by non-state actors. And these abuses include the deliberate targeting of children. So we're talking about a systemic problem that is raising very fundamental challenges for our collective action and our collective endeavour to protect children. The one thing I would say purely on this is anecdotal, but I always feel that when you use these big numbers, 350 million children living in a conflict area, over 15,000 violations of the rights of children to be protected, it doesn't do justice actually to the sheer horror of what we're talking about. And since starting at Save the Children, I've visited a number of our programs from Maiduguri in Borno, where I've spoken to children who are affected by Boko Haram. More recently to the Rohingya children in Cox's Bazar, and in Yemen, where I've met children in hospitals. And there is nothing as harrowing as speaking to a child of 7 who has seen their father shot, of speaking to the mother of a 9-year-old in a hospital in Sana'a in Yemen, of a child who has just about been kept alive because they managed to find some of the drugs that hadn't been subjected to a humanitarian blockade. So for me, what we're dealing with here, behind these numbers, is a fundamental failure in our collective responsibility to protect children who have a right to expect better of us collectively in terms of providing protection. Behind this sense of impunity surrounding what are crimes against children conducted by militaries and non-state actors around the world, I would say several failures of our normative and rights-based architecture. That architecture includes international criminal law enshrined in the Rome Statute, which is there to provide multilateral justice where national justice systems fail to protect vulnerable populations. It includes international humanitarian law and the various normative standards associated with humanitarian law, and the customary laws associated with it, such as proportionality in the use of force. It includes failures of international human rights law. Our organisation, actually our founder, was one of the architects of international human rights law, specifically on children, laws that are now enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But it's clear that these 3 sets of law-based or normatively based provisions are fundamentally failing. And if they weren't failing, we wouldn't have this sense of impunity on the part of the actors who are responsible for the crimes that I've outlined. I do also want to mention in this that it's not just the hard legal end that is failing. The customary aspects of international humanitarian law in particular are incredibly important. And I think you just have to look at the scenes of what is happening in Eastern Ghouta today, or Aleppo, to understand that the principle of proportionality has gone straight out of the window. The idea that you can use high ordnance explosives in high density urban areas, in the full knowledge that there are large numbers of children in these areas, that you're using weaponry which is not precise and which is very likely either to harm these children or to destroy the infrastructure on which they depend, the sanitation systems, the school systems, and so on, again has become a normalized aspect of military strategy. So that's quite a lot about the problem. So let me say a few words on what I think potential solutions might look like. One of the things that we highlight in the report that I mentioned is the importance of better data of the impacts of conflict on children. Now, we have the monitoring and reporting mechanism, but that mechanism is very partial. It doesn't cover a number of conflicts, and even in the case of the conflicts that it does cover, the data is incomplete. So I think we all have a responsibility to get better at documenting and capturing the sheer scale and the nature of the impacts on children that we're discussing here. We need a far greater level of awareness in the military. One of the reasons that I'm very glad that we're having the discussions that we're having with NATO and that we're having with the Ministry of Defence here is that these are institutions which can have an effect in changing the norms on the ground. We need the military commanders who are overseeing operations in Iraq or other parts of the world to think about the consequences of their action and to think about what does the principle of proportionality mean before I give the order for this specific strike. That is not happening at the moment, and we need a far greater level of awareness and engagement between organisations like ours, with yourselves, and with militaries. We clearly have to strengthen normative standards. Now, I know it's very easy to say, in fact I've already said myself, that part of the problem that we've got is that nobody cares, or the actors in conflicts who can make a difference don't care about normative standards. But I do believe that normative standards that are applied and advocated for at the right level can make a difference. Now we clearly need, right now, normative standards which filter down into the field level about the use of high explosive ordinances in high density urban areas. The very simple principle, one of the things that we're advocating very strongly for in Save the Children is a Safe Schools declaration. Many people would regard it as blindingly obvious that you shouldn't bomb a school, but that is clearly not blindingly obvious to many of the actors in the conflicts that we're discussing. I think having the weight of governments and non-state actors behind this type of declaration can make a difference. There's no one-shot antidote to impunity or a sense of impunity. But what we need to do to challenge the culture of impunity is to shift the risk assessment that individuals in the chain of command make before orders are given and before decisions are taken. One example that I often use is that of President Pinochet, who, when he visited the UK in the late 1990s, was arrested under a warrant issued by a Spanish prosecuting authority. The reason that he could be arrested in the UK was that the UK was not only signatory to the Convention on Torture, but it had enshrined the Convention on Torture into UK legislation. So it was justiciable in UK law. Now, there has to be something wrong with a system that allows those responsible for deliberately targeting children, for operating humanitarian blockades which are killing huge numbers of children, those responsible for bombing schools, including members of the Security Council, to act with complete impunity, to own property in Belgravia with no fear that their property might be confiscated as a result of the crimes they're committing in another country. If you commit a fraud in another country, your property is at threat, as is your personal liberty. Yet these heinous crimes against children have no grounding in the UK laws that could help to shift the incentives. So, is this something we can address? How can we make the International Criminal Court a more effective forum for addressing some of these challenges? The final part of what I would see as a sort of framework for solutions is recognizing that whatever we do, immense damage has been caused to millions of children as a result of our failures of protection. These are children who have been traumatized, who need help rebuilding their lives. These are children who need a reconstruction of infrastructure in school, including the education infrastructure, the health infrastructure. And again, one of the things that we're advocating for in Save the Children is proper investment in counselling for children who have been traumatised. We've got 400,000 Rohingya children in Cox's Bazar who have experienced or witnessed appalling things. The level of support for those children, psychological support, is almost non-existent. Now, the idea that you can put them back in a classroom and they're going to learn, given what's happened to them, is clearly mistaken. So we need to start thinking about how do we support and help children to rebuild their lives. Perhaps the greatest of all of the lessons that we can take out of this is that prevention is better than cure. that we, I think, collectively as an international community have underinvested in peace building and conflict prevention. And that is something that has to change. I'm very encouraged by the fact that both the UN Secretary General and the President of the World Bank have made this a major priority. So let's also invest more in prevention. So I think I'm going to leave it there, Virginia.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you very much. Plenty of food for thought. I'll now turn to my colleague Anastasia, who will touch upon a slightly different angle of the problem, especially how children become involved in non-state armed groups. Anastasia.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to briefly think about the questions how and why are child soldiers used by rebel groups, and what kind of armed groups, non-state actors, what kind of tactics do non-state actors use to integrate child recruits and create obedience among them, and perhaps some implications for DDR programs, demobilization, reintegration of child soldiers. The first point I'd like to make is that children have always, for a long time, been used in conflict in various roles, unfortunately. They have been used as porters, cooks, messengers, spies. Tamil Tigers, for example, train child recruits as messengers and spies before they could use a real gun, and only by the age of 10 they became combatants once they were strong enough to hold the gun. And in fact, I think research shows that some of the motivations for children joining armed groups have been related to the skills they would learn or acquire in being members of armed groups. Some have responsibilities on base and were expected to possess a range of supportive skills such as fetching water and firewood. Not all children have been taken along to battles, but obviously currently there is an increasing use of child soldiers as active participants in conflict, and the average age of suicide bomber is also getting younger, I think, according to all data. So I think in general it's important to note that this field of research has been quite divided, although there is some more nuanced understanding now, between those who describe child soldiers as victims who have been intimidated by adults and forced into child soldiering, and the second one that describes them as, some at least, describe them as ruthless perpetrators who see violence as a way to obtain respect, social justice, political and economic opportunities. And in fact, I think it's really important to recognize that they can be both victims and perpetrators, that it's difficult to give any broad generalizations that would place child soldiers into a particular category, because some may get involved with armed groups and collective violence in order to gain a better position, status, power, just basic goods. So it may be slightly opportunistic, or it may be just for creating, just for satisfying some basic needs. So in Sierra Leone, for example, children joined armed groups to satisfy basic needs for food and protection, or to exact revenge for lost loved ones. And even in Afghanistan, the need for food and shelter motivate children to enlist. And Taliban insurgents have been bribing starving children to plant roadside bombs and act as suicide bombers. So it's really difficult to make any sorts of generalizations. Some are promised scholarships, jobs, education, money as well, and that may motivate them to join. And it's also important to recognize that even where, so there is a kind of dichotomy in some of the research between what's seen as forced recruitment or abductions of children and voluntary joining. So I think, but I think it's important to recognize that even what is referred to as voluntary recruitment can be seen as tactical or frequently driven by deprivation, lack of opportunities, because living in conflict-affected countries, children typically have few opportunities for development, face mismanagement, lack of educational opportunities, frequently power abuse, bribery, corruption on a daily basis, which does sometimes create motivations for taking up arms. So it's the state's failure to provide for the population that really should be addressed, I would argue, in order to create some of the solutions for this problem. Obviously, yes, it's states sinking to seemingly permanent crisis. Those that are hurt the most are the young people emerging from impoverished backgrounds, that education, and who seek an alternative and who frequently don't see any other alternative than joining an armed group. In the case of forced recruitment, recruiters typically target places where children are most vulnerable, as Kevin also mentioned briefly the importance of addressing schools as a major venue for presence of children. So of course they gather in greatest numbers in places such as schools, orphanages, refugee camps, churches, and sometimes in the case of, for example, ISIS recruitment, or that of the Philippines Moro Islamic Liberation Front, members encourage children to engage with in militant activities along with their family, and they are also sometimes bought as for money. So there are reports of in Mali and the Philippines and in other places in Pakistan, there are reports of parents being given sums of money to allow children to be part to make parents give their children away to the armed group. So why are children increasingly used for participating in conflict? Well, I think they are frequently seen as easier to interact with. So they are seen as more obedient, or it's easier sometimes to make them listen. It's easier to, at least some armed groups see them as easier targets for indoctrination and ideological penetration, and it can also be relatively easy to engage them in different sorts of tactics, such as suicide bombings, where grown-ups are perhaps more difficult to convince. Where armed groups do not stand a chance for confronting an adult, they find it really a lot easier to interact with children in ways that they find beneficial for their cause. And so I think, yes, in terms of solutions, in terms of ways to address potential ways to address the problem, I think it's really important to look at the ways states, as I mentioned before, manage educational opportunities, development opportunities, and so that children have less incentives to be engaged in armed activities in the first place. Of course, it's really, even if it is difficult to prevent children from engaging in conflict with non-state armed actors, it is even more difficult to the challenges of rehabilitating children and engaging them properly in DDR programs are even greater, because there are still very few viable opportunities for engagement, for meaningful engagement in society for children in post-conflict societies. And I think it should be a priority for states to try and create stronger ground that would create opportunities
Well, thank you very much. Well, we now have about 20 minutes for questions and comments from the audience. If you would like to make a contribution, please raise your hand and wait for me to call on you. We have a roving microphone, and so just wait for the microphone to come to you. And if you could please also introduce yourself and tell us which organization you come from. Ben Barry, first of all.
I'm with IISS, I'm the land warfare expert. I think what we have seen over the last 15, 20 years is a trend in Western armed forces to attempt to apply force with greater precision, discrimination, and actually less lethality in order to reduce the chance of civilian casualties and collateral damage. So that is good for children. The same technology, of course, can be used by ruthless regimes for precision ruthlessness. But that's a sort of, that's a very difficult political challenge. I think the other thing I'd observe is that there is an issue about, there's a very hard issue about de-radicalisation. I mean, the Pakistan army tell a sad but interesting story of how shocked they were to find when they cleared Sawat how many potential teenage suicide bombers they captured, and off their own initiative set up a de-radicalisation programme. But I don't think there's any easy answers, but encouraging militaries to behave with more precision and less lethality. And I'd also argue for more informed commentary and analysis. I mean, as an example, a properly professionally trained sniper is much more precise and less lethal than a tank gun, but when you listen to commentary of street battles, snipers are often portrayed as bad in principle. But thank you very much for a really thoughtful survey of what I think is a really difficult issue.
Would you want to react to comment?
Well, not really. Just to thank you for it. It's a really important observation. I mean, to my mind, there are two aspects of de-radicalisation, and one of them is exactly as you've said, that that we're not dealing here with small-scale, countries like Afghanistan or Pakistan or Somalia. These are not small-scale problems. And we do need a systemic response of the type that you described. I would also say there's a preventative element on de-radicalisation. And if I could just give one example of that, I've had an opportunity to visit our programs in Somalia a few times since I started. And certainly in South Central Somalia, there are many areas that are de facto controlled by Al-Shabaab. And this is an area that's been quite intensively targeted by the US in particular. But one of the things that really strikes you when you go out of the very safe urban areas into areas that we can only operate in on an intermittent basis is that there is no state. There's just nothing there. There are no schools, there's no health systems, no irrigation systems, and the sense that the state does nothing and is powerless is at the heart of a radicalisation problem, because if you have no state and you have no employment and livelihood opportunities that might arise from investments by the state in infrastructure systems or in livelihood systems, you're really opening the door to people who, as Anastasia has said, there's no other livelihood and someone offers you $20 a month to run around with an AK-47 and take pot shots at the African peacekeeping force. This is an alternative. And in that context, one of the things we've been arguing for in cases like Somalia is that we've got into a mindset as an international community of treating it as a sort of short-term humanitarian problem. So every year we have an emergency appeal. I mean, it's absolutely guaranteed there'll be an emergency appeal for Somalia this year. It's all done on 6-month budget lines, 9-month budget lines, and nobody is thinking about how do we develop a long-term recovery strategy, the long-term investment plans in areas that can be adequately protected, where there would be a very high return in terms of creating livelihood opportunities. And yet we haven't managed to mobilize the long-term funding to do that. And in the specific case of Somalia, that's partly because of issues connected with debt arrears for the countries. And the failure of the IMF and the World Bank and creditors to write off these old debts, which could potentially open the door to new longer-term financing, I would say would be a central part of any sensible de-radicalization strategy. Because if you take out long-term financing, in the end, you're going to be dealing with a very large-scale problem in this area. So really just to agree with you and to say that that's a critical area.
So do you want to add anything?
I agree with everything Kevin mentions, and I would just perhaps add that I think this problem is compounded by two additional factors that are part of the problem. First, that children in conflict areas obviously grow up with horrific experiences of violence, both as victims and sometimes perpetrators. And when they see it from an early age and they internalize those experiences, that makes it so much more difficult to do any kind of de-radicalization or rehabilitation activities. And the second aspect of the problem is that non-state armed actors, of course, frequently cut off any opportunity, or most opportunities for outside interaction for their recruits. So there is frequently a psychological perception of the group being a big family and creation of ties of allegiance and loyalty, and frequently actually deliberate efforts are made to cut off any outside interaction or communication, so they are very, very isolated and see themselves as part of the big family. So I think that is that is an additional barrier that is difficult to break, because when they do try to reintegrate into the wider society, that psychological impact of this list still remains, and it's just harder for them to communicate.
It's a very important point to remember. Thank you. We have Nick over there, and then we have 1 and 2 here.
Thank you. Nicholas Redmond, Director of Editorial here at IISS. And with apologies to my colleague Anastasia, it's a question for Peter. And it follows on from Ben Barry's point about the experience of UK and NATO militaries targeting with much more care over the last 15, 20 years. And it's with regard to Yemen. The obvious solution for Britain would appear to be to simply stop supply of weapons, so we'd not have any culpability in it. Whether that would actually change anything on the ground, or whether the Saudis would simply buy their weapons elsewhere, is another question. And so I wonder if part of the solution is actually to continue to sell weapons, but to insist that there be a stronger military advisory element, on the basis at least then there is more of a chance, potentially, of these better practices being passed across. Very difficult for a government to do it because it means getting your hands dirty, and difficult for a charity to advocate it for the same reason. But I wonder, as part of a raft of measures, could this be something that's worthwhile considering?
It's Kevin, not Peter.
Sorry.
No, I was just wondering if there's a Peter hiding somewhere, isn't it? Your Yemen expert, Peter. Yeah, so I think the truth is that there are seldom binary solutions to these things. You know, a weapons boycott on its own is not necessarily going to produce the right result. On the other hand, engagement without a stronger sense that there are consequences for failures to adhere to international humanitarian law, which is arguably where we are right now, is not delivering results either. And, you know, I mean, I have heard it argued that the UK and other militaries have been engaged in trying to improve targeting practices on the part of the Saudi-led coalition. And maybe there have been improvements, but it's still the case over 800 schools have been hit and over 600 health centres. So that is not working. And we do have a humanitarian blockade, which is threatening to cause a famine. So it seems to me that there has to be a far greater sense that the UK, not acting alone, but acting in concert with other allies, with the US, with other countries in Western Europe, will not accept this humanitarian blockade. And I would say strategies that have to be considered would be the use of military support to ensure that ships carrying humanitarian supplies can enter the port of Hodeidah. And we won't accept UK charities, including ours, having their humanitarian supplies diverted or held up and obstructed. And I hope this was a central part of the dialogue between the Foreign Secretary and the Saudis in the current visit, or the visit that ended yesterday. But I think what is not acceptable is to have a strategy where the central message is that there is dialogue going on behind closed doors over a very long period to no discernible effect on the lives of many hundreds of thousands of children that are at risk as a result of current Saudi practices.
Thank you. There was a lady in the first row.
Hi, I'm an analyst at IHS Jane's Terrorism and Insurgency Centre. This is a question for you, Anastasia. So you've highlighted that there are two perspectives in terms of child soldiers, one that they are victims and the other that they are ruthless perpetrators. And whilst many would argue that due to the power dynamic between a militant commander, for example, and a child is always going to be disproportionate towards the child, do you think at any point these so-called ruthless perpetrators and counter-terrorism efforts and operations targeted towards them could ever be justified? Because some people would say that children, perhaps to the age of adulthood, will always be perceived as innocent and not ruthless perpetrators. They'll always have a certain degree of manipulation directed towards them in this context. So do you think that that security forces can be justified in targeting them since they're seen as ruthless?
We'll take perhaps other two questions because we're kind of short on time. There was a gentleman over there and then the first row.
Thank you. I'm Nasser Salim. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Law at Tripoli University in Libya. So my question to Mr. Kevin, 2011, the NATO operations continued for about 8 months. In 2014, it was a conflict in Tripoli, the capital city, and in Benghazi. 2016, it was a war against ISIS in Sirte, in the middle of Libya. So with all that, some children died, some children lost a member of their families, lost schools destroyed. But in the page 19 in the report, I cannot see Libya with the most dangerous countries for children. So my question is, do you have any idea about the children's situation in Libya? Thank you.
Thank you. And there was a gentleman in the first row here, and then the gentleman in the second, and then I'm sorry for everyone else, but we don't have much time left.
Michael Fulkerson from the Canadian High Commission here in London. Thank you for a very interesting report and presentations today. horrifying, but a lot to think about. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about gender differences, children in armed conflict situations, different types of vulnerabilities, approaches for humanitarian intervention or longer-term development, and DDR specifically.
Thank you. And the final question, the gentleman over there.
Thank you. My name is David Wilcock. I'm a reporter from the Press Association. It's a question for Mr. Watkins, really. I'm sorry to be the one to bring recent sex abuse problems into this, but it is actually in the context of what you were saying earlier regarding state actors like the Saudis acting with impunity about against children. I was wondering, organisations like Save the Children, one of your strongest weapons, using that term, is your moral authority. Especially when faced with people who have massive military budgets and PR budgets. I was wondering what effect the recent events in the sector in general have had on that moral authority and your ability to act on the ground and in Whitehall collectively.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have 4 questions. I will now come back to our speakers, perhaps in reverse order. So if Anastasia, you would like to answer the questions that were relevant to you, and then I will turn to you, Kevin, for the final word.
That's a challenging question to answer. I think it's not, as I said in my presentation, I think it's not entirely appropriate to see child soldiers as just perpetrators, because there are so many different motivations for them to carry out these acts of violence, and sometimes, frequently, these acts are not clearly not voluntary. So I think obviously counterterrorism operations do frequently target all perpetrators, and in those instances it is frequently, fortunately, kind of becomes inevitable that children become targeted. But I certainly wouldn't want to pass a moral judgment on the idea that attacks are justifiable, because I think it's important to recognize that reality is multifaceted, and they are frequently not really voluntary, even when they do join, not entirely through abductions, but there are factors behind them carrying out acts of violence that make it not voluntary. So I think it's important to recognize that in any sort of counter-terrorism strategy.
Thank you. So I'll take the questions in reverse order.
Sure.
Actually, thank you for asking that question. It's, I think this is a really critical moment for our sector, and being defensive or burying our heads in the sand is not a smart thing to do right now. And a lot of the press coverage of our organisation and of other organisations in the sector has obviously been very uncomfortable over the last month. But we owe the journalists who have done these investigations a debt of gratitude, actually, because they've turned a spotlight on things that need to be addressed. And I would say there are two there are two critical things that I'm thinking about a lot in my role, and I know my colleagues are on the leadership team as well. One of them is how effectively we discharge our safeguarding and protection responsibilities as an organisation on the ground. And this really matters, because we come into contact every day with some of the most vulnerable children and women in the world. And I'm not saying any of this lightly. You know, that we're dealing with people who have suffered appalling violence. They've been uprooted. Many of them have been forced to move into other countries where they may not be welcome, where they don't speak the language. They're impoverished. They're traumatized. They don't know where the next meal is coming from. You know, you've got mothers with 2 or 3 children who don't know whether they're going to be able to feed them tomorrow. You know, parents with kids who are sick, who don't know where the treatment is going to come from. Now, if you're in a position of a gatekeeper to aid, you have enormous power in relation to those people. And the corollary of that enormous power ought to be a very highly developed sense of responsibility of your duty to provide proper protection. And it is clearly the case that there are failures of protection that have happened. Now, you can say those failures have happened because we're operating in tough environments, you know, in conflict-affected areas, in areas where there's no rule of law, there's no functioning police force. And because of that, somehow lower standards should apply. Actually, that's totally the opposite of the truth. It's precisely because you're operating in those environments that you, and with those people, with that level of vulnerability, you should be applying higher standards. So we need to be investing more in our safeguarding and protection systems than we have been. We need to get way better at reporting and monitoring on failures where they occur. I'm doing it openly. Actually, there's no, there's a dilemma with this, because if you report failures, of course the media will latch on to those failures and treat them in a particular way. But that's not a reason not to do it. You know, we have to be confident enough as organisations to say, if it looks like our numbers are going up, and that reflects the fact that we're better at documenting things, that's something to be proud of. So what we've been arguing for in Save the Children is that because we're a children's charity, we can apply quite stringent criminal checks on recruitment in the UK. But when you're operating globally, you need that system operating on a multilateral basis, and we don't have it at the moment. So we're in discussions with Interpol, among others, to try and work out ways of creating that sort of system. The second area of failure is in our organisational culture. And there have been things that I've read about, things that I've heard from our staff that disturb me, and things that are not acceptable. And I hope I've signalled a very clear view on this since I started as CEO, that I have a zero tolerance approach to any form of bullying or sexual harassment. It is not going to happen on my watch. But we do have an issue, and we have a legacy that I have to deal with. And that's one of the reasons that I've established an independent review, which I've recused myself from, partly because I'm a CEO, but also because I was a trustee during the period that some of these issues are reported. And it's quite proper that they do have to be independently investigated, and we have to draw the consequences and apply the recommendations that come out. The one thing I will say before I move on is that there is a constant theme in all of these cases, which is a gender theme, that the victims on the front line and in our organisational cultures are invariably women, and the perpetrators are overwhelmingly men. So there's no point pretending that this is just an issue in our sector. I mean, let's be honest, happens in Hollywood, it happens in football clubs, it happens in the city, it happens in the media. So, but none of that diminishes the responsibility that I have to make sure it doesn't happen in my organisation. And, on my watch, it is not going to happen in the future. So I hope that addresses, partially at least, that question. On Libya, you're right, Libya isn't mentioned on page 19, but is mentioned on page 36, where what we identify, citing research of a group called Air Wars, which monitors the impact of airstrikes on civilian populations, and it draws attention to the fact that in 3 of the conflicts that they cover, Syria, Iraq, and Libya, there's a huge discrepancy between what is reported by the major powers who are responsible for the airstrikes in terms of civilian casualties and the numbers. And I don't recall the exact numbers, but the numbers reported by the military authority, I think for the 3 countries, is under 100 civilian casualties, whereas the number that's reported by Air Wars is over 6,000. So I don't know what the truth of these figures are, but I think your question is a really important one because it highlights a data difficulty in this, that there are many countries where the data reporting that's available is very partial, and I think Libya is clearly one of them. So that point is well taken. And with the next version of this report, we'll certainly be saying more about Libya. So thank you for that. On the gender point, I do think understanding the gender dynamics at play is very critical here. So there's a broad thing that in almost all of the cases we're concerned about, there are risks facing young girls and women that are different than the risks that face young boys, but the pattern of those risks does vary quite a lot across different conflicts. The sort of risks that we see being played out in ISIL-controlled areas, or we have seen played out in ISIL-controlled areas of Syria or Iraq, do take on a different pattern than you see in Boko Haram areas that you've studied, Virginia. So we need to understand them better. But we also need to recognise that there is a skewing of risks towards vulnerable young girls and women in many different contexts, including the safeguarding context. So, if you look at the Secretary-General's last report on safeguarding failures by UN peacekeeping forces, I don't remember the precise numbers, but there are something like 320 cases reported. In 302 of those cases, the victim is either a woman or a young girl. So 302 out of 320 or so. So there is a massive skewing of risk and the types of behaviours that we need to stamp out towards young women and girls.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This was an excellent discussion, I thought. Thank you, everyone, for their contributions and for those who tune in remotely. Since I won't try to summarize it because we've already overrun, but since we are here, I'd like also to alert you to another event that we are running next week that carries on in this with this theme of bringing together experts from different communities. Next Wednesday at 5:30, we'll be having a special evening where we be showing a documentary on the migration crisis and responses to the to migration from a European perspective. After which we'll have a panel discussion, including experts from a defense background, alongside with humanitarian and human rights experts. So if you're interested, please get in touch or check the details on our website next Wednesday at 5:30 in this room. But for now, please join me in thanking our speakers, and have a good weekend, everyone.